Hello everyone, my name is Maria Talento. I'm a statistician from the Statistics Division, ESCAP in Bangkok, Thailand. I will be presenting the Disaster-Related Statistics Framework, or the Drsf, a guideline developed by ESCAP for producing disaster-related statistics. The structure of this presentation will revolve around the rationale, why a statistical framework, the timeline of the DRSF, the overview and contents of the DRSF, and lastly, the current initiatives and support of ESCAP on disaster-related statistics. On the rationale or motivation in developing the DRSF, well, as the Asia-Pacific is the most disaster-prone region in the world, there was a call for improved statistics to strengthen evidence-based disaster risk management policy in the region. However, countries have different practices of compiling data, and numerous institutions collect data on disasters which are oftentimes uncoordinated. So with these challenges, the demand for a statistical framework came about. More so, there was a need to improve statistical databases, the need for harmonized and comparable methods across countries, and to bridge the gap between disaster risk management information with socioeconomic statistics. Among the uses of disaster-related statistics is to generate information on disaster management planning, post-disaster assessment. It also leads to compilation of indicators for international monitoring and to develop improved capacities for research. And all of this eventually will form part of the integrated sustainable development policy of the country. On the policy context, this shows the graphical representation of the previous slide, which is the national and international applications and advantages of having a harmonized national disaster-related statistics in a country. And that is to produce statistical compilations for disaster risk reduction from relevant agency that will be used for informed decision making at the local and national levels and for international indicators reporting and monitoring. Why a statistical framework? There's a need to emphasize on why specifically a statistical framework is needed. So given that the Sendai framework and the SDG already defines that what needs to be measured, the role of the statistical framework is how to meet the above information demands. And a statistical framework is a tool whereby different statistics calculated coming from multiple sources and agencies can be integrated. On the timelines of the process of the development of the DRSF, I would just discuss the important milestones. So it was in May 2014 that the expert group was established to develop the basic range of disaster-related statistics for the region. In the following year, in May 2015, the Sendai framework on the DRR was adopted in the World Conference, which calls for the development of disaster statistics at the local and international level. And by September of that year, the 2030 SDGs was adopted by all member states. By April 2018, the expert group finalizes its work on the DRSF, And by May 2018, the Statistical Commission recommends the review of the DRSF by the Committee on Statistics and the Committee on Disaster Risk Reduction. By April 2018, the Committee on Statistics endorses the DRSF, and by August 2019, the Committee on Disaster Risk Reduction noted the work of the expert group in developing the DRSF. For an overview of the DRSF, it is a set of guidelines on how to develop a common and harmonized basic range of disaster-related statistics, where different sets of data coming from multiple agencies are integrated to produce relevant information on all the phases of disaster risk management, as you can see here on the slide. It is also accompanied by a core set of statistical tables and examples of good country practices, as well as training materials using GIS to produce disaster-related statistics. In a nutshell, the contents of the DRSF is composed of two parts. Part one is a conceptual framework, which applies the concepts from Sendai and other references for data collection and compilation. And part two consists of the implementation framework, which includes the steps on how to implement the DRSF on a national scale and how to operationalize and compile the basic range of disaster-related statistics. Who were responsible for the development of the DRSF? So it was developed by the expert group, which was led by ESCAP, in collaboration with the NSOs, the National Disaster Management Agencies in the region, international experts, UN agencies, and other international organizations. And it was developed through iterative processes, which are based on current country practices, pilot studies, expert group meetings, and workshops and seminars. And it took 4 years, duration of 4 years, to be able to finish the DRSF. So we move on to the contents of the DRSF, which is part one, the conceptual framework. And the figure as shown here represents how the basic range of disaster-related statistics is broadly organized in the DRSF. It consists of the core items that are needed for the measurement of disaster risk reduction before, during, and after disasters. So before disasters, for example, information on hazards and the three elements of disaster risk measurements such as exposure, vulnerability, and coping capacity or the risk assessment are needed. So the DRSF provides standardized concepts and definition of each element, the required data, the sources of information, and guidance on the methods or approaches of estimation. So the same also applies to the elements and topics during and after the disaster. On this table, the following three slides after this will spell out in detail what I mentioned in the previous slide. So, and this table shows and indicates what statistics can be produced if one follows the conceptual framework, which is part one, and the implementation guidelines of part two. So, for example, you want to measure exposure to hazards, which is an information required before a disaster. So the DRSF provides background information, and the concept of exposure to hazards is explained, and it also provides information on the data and statistics that are required and the sources of data, and also the indicators that will be generated from the statistics. So in here, for the exposure to hazards, the data and statistics that are required will be a hazard map, map of population, critical of infrastructure, population density, land cover use, and household income. And the indicators that will be generated here would be hazard exposure by geographic regions, population exposure by social groups, and exposure of land and infrastructure by hazard type. So let's have a look at another example, which is the measurement of the direct impacts of disaster, and which is measured in terms of economic loss. So the DRSF provides the context, the background of the direct impacts, and all the information on the variables related to the direct impacts like environment, cultural heritage, human impacts, material impacts. And it also shows the data and statistics that are required to be able to measure the direct impacts of disaster. And also, it generates the indicators that will be generated out of the statistics. So for economic loss, the indicator here would be the effect on disasters on GDP, damage to ecosystems by land cover type, damage to natural resources, and damage to atmosphere. So these may be expressed in terms of physical units and monetary units. So I would not go over all the examples in the interest of time, but we have included in this presentation all the important elements in all phases of disaster risk management for your reference. So there are about 4 tables here that provides the details of the basic range of disaster-related statistics in the conceptual framework. So now that we have finished with the contents of part 1, let's move to the second part, which is the implementation framework. And it outlines here the basic steps for implementation of the disaster-related statistics on the national level. The first one being the first one is establishing an institutional environment for official disaster-related statistics. So in here we have 5 steps of the checklist, and these are outlined based on the common understanding of the fundamental principles of official statistics adopted by the UN General Assembly in 2014. The second step is establishing the institutional arrangement. So among the responsibilities of the NSOs here is to establish methodological standards, reviewing tools for improving availability of statistics, and the use of big data for additional information. While the contribution of the national disaster management agencies would be in terms of coordinating and leading the implementation of disaster risk management. The third step for implementation is statistical coordination. So once a suitable environment and arrangements are established, statistical coordination should follow. And this is in terms of establishing an interagency committee or a technical working group. And the purpose of this is establishing roles and responsibilities among agencies and to map out existing data and resources. And the fourth one is the use of GIS. So it's highly encouraged because it is an indispensable tool as nearly all components of the basic range of statistics rely on GIS for analysis. And the fifth one would be prioritization. The country would need to identify and adopt priorities based on further statistical development, and also it's taking into consideration their priority policies and expected uses for all stakeholders. And the last one would be the development of statistical standards, and with the development of priorities, the agencies are now ready to establish standards for harmonization and consistencies in all the variables and data over time, and adopt common definitions and glossaries, and adopt classification, harmonized classification and standards for measurement units. We now move on to the last part of the implementation framework, which is the summary of statistics table. So this is a collection of the basic templates for extracting statistics that was developed for the DRSF in line with the recommendations of the handbook. So this basic range of statistical tables were developed based on pilot studies and extensive discussions by the expert group. And most of the statistics in the basic range are compatible with GIS. So I have put here the link to the complete DRSF statistical tables for your reference. So these are the basic range of disaster-related statistics, which are organized according to generic tables or categories of tables as follows. So it follows the order by order, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and the last one being the disaster reduction expenditure accounts. And these are arranged in the order of the different phases of disaster risk management. So this slide provides the information that if you use the DRSF, these tables can be produced. Like, for example, this slide shows the summary of statistics table that are recommended for compilation before a disaster. And these are the tables here refer to the B tables and DRR tables. So the B tables are those required to assess hazard exposure statistics, which are compiled before disaster occurrences, and the DRRE provides the background statistics on coping capacity and resilience. So you can see here the following two slides, an example of a B table that can be produced. This is the table on population background statistics and hazard exposure by geographic regions. So for each disaster occurrence, there has to be at least three characteristics of the event that should be recorded. And these are the hazard type, scale, and geographic region. This is another example of a DRR table that is recommended for compilation before a disaster. And this is on transfer expenditure account and national expenditure, which are expressed in monetary terms. So the aim of this table is to identify the portions of activities with a primary risk reduction purpose. I will not go through all the tables, but the next 10 slides or so will give you examples of detailed statistical tables that can be generated to provide indicators on all the phases of disaster risk management. So there are about 10 slides for this one, just for the reference. And finally, for the last item of the presentation, shows the current initiative of ESCAP on disaster-related statistics. So after the endorsement of the DRSF, there needs to be a transition from the development of the DRSF to the actual implementation of the framework. And a reconfigured regional TWG and its terms of reference were approved by the Bureau of the Committee on Statistics in April 2019. And among its functions are to provide a platform for sharing of country experiences, maintain and expand the pool of expertise for technical support, develop materials for technical training, among others. So at present, ESCAP supports the TWG in terms of providing secretariat services, providing the electronic platform called the Confluence for a more efficient conduct of its work. And it has also produced e-learning materials for capacity development of countries. And it came up with 2 reports, namely regional situational analysis and a country case study. So ESCAP also provides support to the rest of the world in terms of the global group called on the disaster-related statistics called the Interagency Expert Group as co-chair, with the objective of developing a common statistical framework on disaster-related statistics. And this is based on the DRSF as a starting point. So this goes to show that the DRSF provides a very good example of a regional effort that can be used as an applicable tool that can be of global relevance. So this ends my presentation, and thank you very much for your attention.